Hi folks, welcome to this recorded lesson on sort of two key ethics from this section of the course. So we've got amateurism. Now we've talked about amateurism last year, but what we're going to be focusing on in year 13 is the concept of 19th century amateurism. So there is a little bit of crossover from what we looked at last year in File Divider 2, which was industrial and post-industrial. And the other sort of content that I want to cover in this video is something called the Olympic Oath. This is actually new to the new specification and hasn't actually come up on an A-level paper. It's come up on a couple of AS questions. Now, what I will have provided to you, so this video has been done slightly differently to normal. This is sort of replacing a taught lesson. So what you will have are 3 handouts that you can use through the duration of this lesson. Okay. So these are the outcomes. We're going to look at the 19th century concept of amateurism. We're also going to sort of do a recap of year 12 content, where we're going to make comparisons between 19th century amateurism with 19th century professionals, but also look at the modern day versions of those two concepts. We're then going to explain the Olympic Oath. Now, I will have provided to you an A4 sheet that basically summarises how the Olympic Oath came about and what it actually means and how it's used. Okay, and then sort of the main, one of the key outcomes I would sort of star is linked to this bottom one here, and this is very much the AO3 element of this lesson. It's looking at whether the Olympic Oath remains relevant, okay, in modern day Olympic Games. So we're going to look at sort of arguments for and against whether the Olympic Oath remains relevant or not. Okay, so that's what we're going to be going through in this video. So what you'll have, and this was handed out by myself, is you'll have a blank version of this slide here. Okay, what I would suggest is get a mini whiteboard and a pen or a scrap piece of paper. It's entirely up to yourself. Okay, and see if you can come up with key knowledge points that will come up in each of those boxes. So you can see, obviously, at the top you've got 19th century amateurs, which is the main thing that we'll look at this year. So this is the sort of the key one that we looked at last year, but is also the key focus of amateurism in year 13. How that compares to modern day amateurs. Remember, from our specification, modern day is post World War II. So that's just using the specification terminology from last year. And then obviously you've got underneath the 19th century professionals and modern day professionals. Okay, the main content or the ethic in spot that we look at is 19th century amateurism. So professionalism is there as a bit of a retrieval of work from last year. So what I would suggest that you do shortly is try and recall and write down what you think should go in each box, and I would pause the video now. So hopefully you've sort of tried to test yourself. And if we look at the main box really, which is the 19th century amateurism, sort of this bit at the top here. Hopefully you've got some of these points. You may have some more there, which is absolutely fine as long as they're relevant. But the main ones, looking out for the 19th century amateurs, they were the main controllers of sport. They were the ones who were the highest status in society because they were from upper class, and therefore they dictated a lot of the sort of sporting authorities. Remember from last year, it was the emerging middle class that codified the laws of the game and eventually created the national governing bodies that still exist to this day for some. The amateurs were regarded as the highest standard of performer in the 19th century, so they were better than the professionals. And also the concept of amateurism in the 19th century is what they played sport for the love of the game. So they played sport to a high moral code. Other ones that you might have talked about, it was taking part was more important than winning, like say playing there for the love of the game. They had no desire to train. And some of you may have also maybe talked about the concept of an all-rounder. What that means, sorry about my writing there. What that is talking about is that because the amateurs didn't train and they were wealthy and they had access to a lot of facilities, they could sort of participate, if you like, in a wide variety of activities. So that's where this concept of an all-rounder came in. Whereas the professionals that we'll talk about shortly, they would specialise in one particular sport because that was their profession. Okay, so that's 19th century. So that's the concept for this year 13 year as well, is the 19th century concept of amateurism. Modern day amateurism, as you can see there, the biggest thing I would also add to here, there is a blurring of the distinction between who is an amateur athlete and who is a professional. Okay, but let's look at the differences. So you can see there, 19th century amateurs are the highest status in society, whereas modern day, post-World War II, they have a much lower status. That's not to say, though, that all high-level performers become professionals. They're not. A really good example for modern-day amateurism is if you look at open golf tournaments, for example. So if you look at the golf majors, the Masters, the British Open, the US Open, and the USPGA, they are all what we call open competitions, particularly the British Open and the US Open. And you will always have two champions at all four majors. You'll have the overall champion, but there'll also be an award going to the leading amateur. So you can still be an amateur performer and compete against top professional athletes. Another really good example from sort of more recent times is if you look at the rise of Emma Raducanu in tennis. When she competed at Wimbledon in the summer of 2021, so this summer, she'd literally just finished her A-levels a few weeks before. So really, even though she was in the Wimbledon Championship, she was pretty much an amateur tennis player. And then obviously a few months later, she went to go and win the US Open title in New York. So again, the performance at the top level is open to everyone. If you qualify or get a wild card, you can compete against, world-class performers. But also certain amateurs would receive funding to train. So again, that's another major difference. Remember, in the 19th century, the amateurs were wealthy, they were upper class, so they did not play for money. Whereas obviously nowadays, amateurs will receive funding to train, maybe to compete in the Olympic Games, for example. Professionals, again, 19th century, it was lower class. They played for employment, remember it was their profession. And again, obviously, the higher the standard of your performance, the more money you could generate. Just noticed a mistake there, I'll just cross this out. So they were allowed to train, okay, because they were trying to improve their standard of performance. Remember, it was the amateurs that weren't necessarily not allowed to train, but it was frowned upon if they trained. Talents were underappreciated. And if you look at modern day, you can see the social class is no longer a barrier. So one of the key things that differentiated whether you were an amateur or professional in the 19th century was social class. Now, it doesn't matter what class you are within society, you can choose to be an amateur or a professional. Modern day professionals now are respected for their talents and efforts. And obviously, high financial rewards, particularly if you look at sports like Premier League football and the sort of the salaries and wages that players earn. And obviously, because they're earning vast amounts of money, they can commit more time to train because it is their profession, it's their job. Okay, so that again, just to reiterate, this is just some retrieval of year 12 content, but also if you look, the main thing to talk about in terms of year 13 is this top left-hand box here. That is the sort of 19th century concept of amateurism. So now we move on to the Olympic Oath. So this slide here is also being provided as a handout for you. This is just sort of giving you sort of the background information really of what the Olympic Oath is, how it was first devised and how it sort of evolved over time. So the gentleman there with the very funky moustache, that is actually Baron Pierre de Coubertin. And he is regarded as the sort of the founder of the modern Olympic Games. And again, another little sort of link here to year 12. Baron Pierre de Coubertin was very much influenced by what he witnessed at the Wenlock Games. Okay, some of you hopefully might be now thinking about what year the first Wenlock Games were taking place, the founder, and the sort of the three main aims for those. Just a reminder, the Wenlock Games first took place in 1850. The founder was a gentleman called Dr. William Penny Brooks, and the three main aims of the Wenlock Games was to aim to promote moral improvements, so things like fair play sportsmanship, physical improvements, so increasing health and fitness, and also intellectual improvement, so using sport as a vehicle for social mobility. And Baron Pierre de Coubertin visited the Wenlock Games, and he sort of took inspiration from the Wenlock Games and took them on a bigger scale. Now, this oath, as you can see, first was taken at the Olympics in Antwerp in Belgium in 1920, and initially, as you can see there, one athlete would be seen as a representative of their team and one judge as a representative, and they would essentially read out that oath in the middle there. In the name of all competitors, I promise that we shall take part in these Olympic Games, respecting and abiding by the rules. So that's a key element linked to the ethic, okay? And then the other key element of it is essentially promoting drug-free sport. Now, obviously, we will look at drugs in sport in more depth later in the year, but sort of not doping or not taking drugs is a big aspect of the Olympic oath. But something else that's sort of within that is giving of your best, giving 100% effort. Okay, so that in the middle box there is what the founding Olympic oath was. Is where an athlete and a judge as a representative of the Olympic officials would basically, the athlete would say that oath, and they're sort of a representative, they're speaking for the rest of their Olympic team. You can see in the final box it has evolved over the years, so to keep it relevant. So in 1972, that's the Olympic Games were in Munich. The oath was just for athletes, but then officials stated the oath as part of it, so it was broader, not just for athletes, but it was also coaches. And also from the 2018 Winter Olympics in North Korea, Pyongyang, the three oaths were combined into one, so there was athletes, coaches and officials. Okay, so it was just trying to show that it wasn't just all about the performers, the athletes, it was everybody who had a crucial role in the Olympic Games, athletes, coaches and officials. Okay, so that is what the Olympic oath is. The Olympic oath is what is said in the middle there, and there's a little bit of history of how it come about. Okay, now, when looking at past exam questions here, what you're looking at here is the AO1 and AO2 for an extended response on the Olympic oath. And on the next slide, I haven't actually got the question as it appeared on the exam paper, but this was the sporting example that was used to highlight, as it says there, is the Olympic oath still relevant? So you can see there the headline there, badminton pairs expelled from the London 2012 Olympics after match fixing scandal. Now, what had actually gone on here, and it was proved to have been correct, is that certain pairs in the badminton doubles were not giving of their best in qualifying rounds to try and get a more preferred route to the Olympic final. Now, another example you could potentially talk about here as well, just to sort of give it more context. I know it's not an Olympics, but if you think back to the Football World Cup in 2018, and if you look at England in that World Cup, okay, the final qualifying game was against Belgium, and it was basically either Belgium or England that would have come out on top in their qualifying group. But what was starting to be out in the media is that you can start to plot your route to the World Cup final, okay? And going back to that Belgium-England game, the winners of that game would have finished top of the group and therefore would have had potentially a more challenging route to the World Cup final. The losers of the game between Belgium and England would have finished runners-up in the group, and it was argued that the runners-up of that group would have had a much easier route to the World Cup final. England obviously lost the game 1-0, if I remember rightly. They then obviously were against Colombia in the round of 16. They won that on penalties. They then went on to play Sweden in the quarter-final, but then obviously came unstuck against Croatia in the semi-finals. But it was a much more straightforward route to the World Cup final than it could have been if England had beaten Belgium. So again, the cynic might say, well, did England permanently lose that game on purpose to try and go the easier route to the final? Obviously, you'll never be able to prove it, but it's that sort of scenario that we're talking about here. The badminton pairs were thrown out of the competition for not giving up their best. They were going against the Olympic oath. Okay? This here, the badminton scenario, was the example given in the extended response question. So the big question comes in, and this is where the AO3 comes in, is the Olympic oath still relevant? If I go back a slide, that bit in the middle there, here, and all the information that we talked about here, is it still relevant in the 21st century? Okay? Now the final sheet that you should have is this, okay? And you can see here that it has been designed to very much cater for the AO3 evidence in an extended response, okay? Is the Olympic oath still relevant? There will be statements where you agree that it is still relevant, which is part of the discussion, but then there's also disagree, where you think it is no longer relevant, okay? What I'd like you to do is to summarise the information on the final slide of this presentation on your blank version of this one, okay? And I'll talk a little bit around them as you do this. So, and this is taken from the mark scheme for the extended response that I was referring to earlier. So there are three statements there that you could argue that the Olympic oath is relevant, okay? The first one there is, the Olympics are still seen as the showcase sporting event in the world. It is still seen as the biggest sporting event, okay? It is still showcasing world-class athletes giving of their best to win. It is still seen as a celebration of sport, okay? Now, the athlete at the bottom there is Ben Johnson. Okay, so this is Ben Johnson here, okay? Now, Ben Johnson is regarded as one of the more famous drug cheats in certainly Olympic history. Some would say he's the most famous drug cheat in sporting history. I would now say probably Lance Armstrong takes that unwanted title. But how does Ben Johnson, or how does the story of Ben Johnson keep the Olympic oath relevant? He was actually the gold medalist. He won the 1988 Olympic 100-metre final. 2 days later, he failed a drugs test for anabolic steroids. He was then disqualified and stripped of his medals after that positive doping test. So therefore, you could argue that the Olympic oath is still relevant because drugs cheats who are caught are stripped of medals and disqualified. And what you're starting to see as drug testing procedures are improving, that even though an athlete may have not triggered a positive doping test in an actual Olympics, let's say in 2012, but let's say 8 years later, because drug testing procedures are improving, those samples given in 2012 would give a positive test in, say, 2021. They are then stripped of medals, okay? And another one, if I just remove the pen mark so it doesn't get confusing, and also the audience, and Justin Gatlin, an American sprinter, is a really good example here. Justin Gatlin has failed more than one drugs test in his career, and there was a very famous race between him and Usain Bolt at the World Athletics Championships. I think it was in 2015, and there's a very famous piece of sports commentary by Steve Cram, and it was seen as Usain Bolt was competing for clean sport, where Justin Gatlin was seen as the drug cheat, and he failed more than one drug test in his career. And the audience, as the athletes were being introduced, Justin Gatlin was being booed because the audience didn't really want a drug cheat competing. Again, that brings in whether the drug punishments are harsh enough, but that will come in drugs in sports section, for example. Okay, but going back to the commentary, when Usain Bolt beat Gatlin, Steve Cram was talking about Usain Bolt has not only regained his title, he may have saved his sport, because of what would the message be like if Justin Gatlin, a multiple drug cheat, had actually beaten Usain Bolt. Okay, so the very fact that the audience don't appreciate drug cheats and boo the athletes could argue that they want to see clean athletes. They do not want to be seeing athletes who have failed drug tests in their career. So those are 3 reasons why you could argue that the Olympic oath is still relevant. Let's have a look at some of the pointers why some people might think it is not relevant anymore. Okay, now going back to drug testing again. Drug testing procedures are way behind. The athletes are one step ahead of the testers. So you might think, I'm prepared to take the risk. I'm prepared to take the gamble. I may take a banned substance with the thought that I may not get caught. And again, the more successful you are in professional sport, you could earn more money, as it says there, more lucrative sponsorship deals. You know, if you are successful at an event like an Olympic Games, you could change your life. You could be commanding bigger salaries for competitions, greater sponsorship contracts, so that you could take the risk. You could decide to cheat, to take that risk, so you choose to ignore it. Second one there is, again, if we go back to Jason Gatlin, yes, Jason Gatlin is booed, but he has also come back after more than one positive drugs test. So some people might think, well, what is the point of the oath? Should athletes who fail a drug test be banned for life? The fact that they're able to come back and compete could argue that the Olympic oath is irrelevant. It's not relevant anymore. And then the final one. Now, there is actually a documentary on Netflix. I haven't watched it yet. It's called Icarus. And it is about the Russian doctor who was the whistleblower behind the state-controlled doping program in Russia. But before then, East Germany, before the Berlin Wall come down in 1989, East Germany were part of the Eastern Bloc, and it was proven categorically that in the 70s and 80s, the East German authorities were running a state-controlled doping program. So, and obviously that has been proven with Russia more recently, and obviously a lot of Russian athletes were not allowed to compete at the last Olympic Games in Tokyo because of this doping offences. So again, the very fact that you've got governments and countries prepared to run a state-controlled doping program to showcase their country at events like Olympic Games, you could argue, as it says there, that the Olympic oath is redundant. Okay. So hopefully you've found this lesson useful and you've made all your relevant notes. Thank you.